I've always considered myself a pretty ordinary guy, just trying to get through my last year of high school in the sleepy suburbs of Denver, Colorado. My name's Jake, and I live with my parents and younger sister in a house that's been in our family for generations. It's the kind of place that feels safe, you know? The sort of place where nothing bad ever really happens. My family's always been close. Every weekend we're either out in the backyard grilling or huddled up in the living room, binge-watching whatever's popular on Netflix. Just our thing. But when they decided to take a weekend trip to Seattle to visit my aunt, I figured it would be nice to have the place to myself for a change. I could study for exams, maybe catch up on some sleep, and just enjoy the quiet. But as soon as they left, that quiet started to feel a little too quiet. Our house is an old two-story with creaky wood floors and a lot of history. My great-grandparents built it, and it's seen a lot over the years. Some of it good, some of it not so much. It's surrounded by thick woods on three sides, which was great for playing hide-and-seek when I was a kid. Now that I'm older, it just feels kind of isolating. We're not exactly in the middle of nowhere, but our nearest neighbors are a good 5-minute walk away. There's something about the way the trees press in close to the house, especially at night, that makes everything feel a little too claustrophobic. Like the world shrinks down to just me and the shadows that creep across the walls when the wind picks up. The first night alone, I remember lying in bed, listening to the familiar groans of the house as it settled. Normally those sounds are comforting, like the house is alive in its own way, keeping us safe. But that night, they just set my nerves on edge. Every creak seemed louder. Every rustle in the leaves outside sounded like footsteps. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as alone as I thought. The first day alone was surprisingly peaceful. I woke up late, made myself some pancakes, and spent most of the day lounging around in my pajamas. It was nice not having to worry about anyone else for a change. No one asking me to help with chores. No little sister barging into my room. Just me and the quiet. By the time evening rolled around, I figured I should probably hit the books. I had a big history exam coming up, and with the house to myself, there was no excuse not to study. I spread my notes out on the kitchen table, the same one where my family usually gathered for dinner, and got to work. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, that comfortable solitude started to feel a bit different. The house seemed to settle into itself, creaks and groans growing louder in the stillness of the night. I tried to focus on my notes, but I kept catching myself glancing up at the windows, half expecting to see something, or someone, standing there. I told myself it was just the usual noises an old house makes, but that didn't stop the prickling sensation at the back of my neck. You know that feeling when you think someone's watching you? It was like that. Except I was alone. Wasn't I? It started with small things. Creak on the stairs that I chalked up to the house settling. Faint thud from upstairs that I tried to ignore, convincing myself it was just a book falling off my desk. But then I noticed the back door. I could have sworn I locked it after dinner, but there it was, just barely open, a sliver of cool night air slipping through the crack. I stood there for a moment, staring at the door, my mind racing through all the possible explanations. Maybe I'd just forgotten to latch it properly. Maybe it had been the wind. But as I closed it, sliding the deadbolt into place, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Then there were the objects. Little things that didn't seem right. My keys, which I always left on the hook by the door, were suddenly on the kitchen counter. The picture frame in the hallway was tilted. Just slightly, like someone had brushed past it. I found my sister's stuffed bear, which she hadn't touched in years, sitting in the middle of the living room floor. I knew I hadn't moved it. No one had. That was when I started thinking back to school. Over the past few weeks, I'd noticed this guy hanging around. Someone I didn't recognize. He'd show up in the halls, always a few steps behind me, never making eye contact. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Now I wasn't so sure. Was it possible? Could someone really be following me? And if they were, could they have followed me home? I shook my head, trying to push the thought away. It was ridiculous. I was just spooking myself, letting my imagination run wild because I was alone in this big empty house. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself, I couldn't shake that gnawing feeling of unease, like something was out there, just beyond the shadows, waiting. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but the house was pitch black and eerily silent. At first, I wasn't sure what had pulled me from sleep, but then I heard it. Soft, deliberate footsteps on the floor below. For a second, I lay there frozen, straining to hear, hoping I'd imagined it. But the footsteps came again, this time closer, moving slowly through the house. My heart started pounding so hard I was sure whoever was down there could hear it. This wasn't the creak of old wood or the settling of the house. This was someone, no, something, moving with intent, like they knew exactly where they were going. My mind raced back to that guy at school, the one who always seemed to be lurking just out of sight. I had tried to forget about him, dismissing the feeling of being followed as paranoia. But now, in the dead of night, with those footsteps echoing through my house, I knew. He had followed me home. Panic surged through me, every nerve on high alert. I had to do something, anything, but my body felt like it was made of lead, pinned to the bed by fear. The footsteps paused, and I realized with a jolt that they were right outside my door. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, hands trembling so badly I nearly dropped it. My first instinct was to call the police, but I couldn't risk making a sound. The footsteps started again, just inches from where I lay, separated by a thin wooden door. With my heart in my throat, I slid out of bed as quietly as I could, my feet barely making a sound on the cold floor. I crept toward the closet, every step feeling like it took an eternity. Just as I slipped inside and closed the door behind me, I heard it. The doorknob of my room turning ever so slowly. I crouched in the darkness, trying to control my breathing, trying to think of anything other than the sheer terror that gripped me. Closet door was thin, and I could hear everything. The soft creak of the door opening, slow, measured breathing of someone standing in my room. I could almost feel their presence, like a weight pressing down on me. Clutched my phone, thumb hovering over the emergency call button. Every instinct screamed at me to stay silent, to remain hidden, but my mind was racing with the horrible realization that if he found me here, there would be nowhere to run. Then the footsteps started again, moving around my room, searching. I bit down on my lip, trying to keep quiet, but every breath felt like a betrayal, a giveaway of my hiding spot. I could hear drawers being opened, the rustling of papers, then the unmistakable sound of something being dragged across the floor. He was looking for me. My mind flashed back to every horror story I'd ever heard, every terrifying scene from a movie. This was real. This was happening to me. I pressed my back against the wall of the closet, as if I could somehow melt into it, wishing with everything I had that this was just a nightmare. But the footsteps kept coming, inching closer to the closet door. I could see the shadow of his feet just outside, hear the slight hitch in his breath as he stood there, as if sensing my presence. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. Then, the handle of the closet door started to turn. The closet door creaked as the handle turned, and I knew I had only seconds to act. My fingers trembled uncontrollably as I finally hit the emergency call button on my phone, praying that the faint sound of the keypad wouldn't give me away. I pressed the phone to my ear, trying to keep my breath steady, trying not to let the terror creeping through my veins paralyze me. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's voice was calm, steady, but to me, it sounded like a lifeline. I forced myself to whisper, my voice barely audible as I gave my address. Please, send help. He's in my house. I'm hiding. I could barely think, barely breathe, as I heard the stalker's footsteps move closer. He was right outside the closet now, his shadow darkening the thin crack under the door. My heart was pounding so loudly in my chest that I was sure he could hear it. Stay on the line, help is on the way, the operator assured me, but her words felt distant, almost unreal. The only thing that felt real was the cold metal of the closet handle as it started to turn, inch by inch. I clamped a hand over my mouth to stifle a gasp. Every instinct screamed me to run, to bite, to do something, but I was trapped. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. This was it. Then, as if by some miracle, the sound of distant sirens broke through the suffocating silence. They were faint at first, growing louder, closer. The stalker hesitated, closet door barely ajar. I could hear him breathing, heavy and ragged, as he realized the police were coming. For a moment, everything was still. Then, with a sudden, desperate movement, turned away from the closet. I heard him rush toward the window, the sound of glass shattering as he forced his way out. I stayed frozen, curled up in the closet, listening as the sirens blared right outside the house. My heart was still hammering, my body shaking uncontrollably. The operator was still on the line, asking if I was okay, but I couldn't find my voice. All I could do was listen, praying that it was really over. Felt like hours before I heard the heavy footsteps of the police entering the house, their voices calling out as they searched room by room. Finally, one of them opened the closet door, and I stumbled out, gasping for breath, still clutching my phone like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. "He's gone," I managed to whisper, my voice barely recognizable. He got away. The rest of that night was a blur. Officers asking questions, my parents rushing back home in a panic, my sister crying as they tried to comfort me. But there was no comfort in their words, no safety in the walls of that house anymore. In the days that followed, fear didn't fade, grew. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every sound made me jump, every shadow seemed like it was hiding something, or someone. I kept thinking back to that moment. Feel of the closet door handle turning, the sound of his breath just inches away. What if the police hadn't arrived in time? What if he came back? My parents didn't need much convincing. They could see what the ordeal had done to me, how it had changed me. Within a week, we were packing up, leaving Denver behind for a small town in New York, where my dad had found a job transfer. They thought it would help, that putting distance between us and that night would let me heal. The fear didn't stay in Denver. Followed me. Even now, months later, in a new house in a new town, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. I find myself looking over my shoulder constantly, double-checking the locks on every door and window. Every time I close my eyes, I see his shadow, hear the sound of those footsteps creeping closer. I know my family's trying to move on, to forget what happened. But for me, the nightmare isn't over. Become a part of me, a shadow that follows me wherever I go. And I can't help but wonder if one day, that shadow will become real again. Because deep down, I know he's still out there. And I know he hasn't forgotten me. I always loved the quiet. Growing up in a small town in Ohio, you get used to it. The stillness, the soft rustle of leaves in the fall, the distant hum of cars on a far-off highway. But that weekend, quiet felt different. It wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, like the air just before a storm. My parents had left for Cincinnati to visit my aunt, who'd fallen ill. I stayed behind because I had a job interview on Monday, my first big step since graduating college a few months ago. I told them I'd be fine, and I meant it. I've always been pretty independent, and besides, I thought a weekend alone would be a good chance to unwind. No parents hovering, no distractions, just me, the house, and a fridge full of leftovers. That first night was exactly what I needed. I parked myself on the couch with some leftover pizza and a few beers, flipping through channels before settling on some old horror movie. I remember laughing at how cheesy it was. The kind of movie that tries too hard to be scary, but ends up just being ridiculous. After the movie, I spent a couple of hours mindlessly scrolling through my phone, catching up on social media and texting a few friends. It was late, and the house had taken on that familiar nighttime stillness. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, making the trees sway and scrape against the windows. It was nothing out of the ordinary, but it made the house feel a bit more isolated, like I was in a world of my own. I didn't think much of it, though. Eventually, I shut off the lights, locked the doors, and headed upstairs to bed. The hallway was dimly lit by a nightlight plugged into the wall, something my mom insisted on keeping there, even though I always told her it was unnecessary. But that night, as I walked past it, I was glad it was there. There was something about the shadows in the corners that seemed a little darker than usual, but I chalked it up to the late hour and my tired eyes. I climbed into bed, pulling the blankets up to my chin. The house creaked as it settled, a sound I'd heard 1,000 times before, but in the silence of the night, it seemed louder, sharper, I brushed it off, telling myself it was just the house cooling down. I was used to those sounds. They were part of the comfort of being home. As I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't help but think how nice it was to have the place to myself. Little did I know, that sense of comfort was about to be shattered in ways I couldn't even begin to imagine. Sometime around midnight, I was jolted awake by a noise. It was faint, almost like a whisper, but it was enough to snap me out of the light sleep I had just fallen into. At first, I wasn't even sure I'd heard anything at all. Maybe it was just a dream, I told myself, or the house settling. I rolled over, trying to get comfortable again. There it was, a soft, irregular sound that seemed to come from downstairs. Footsteps. I froze, listening intently, holding my breath. But after a few seconds, the noise stopped. I tried to brush it off, rationalizing that it must have been something harmless. Maybe the wind had knocked something over outside, or maybe a neighbor's cat had found its way onto our porch again. Still, the sound had unnerved me. I sat up in bed, straining to hear any other signs of movement. The house was silent. Too silent. After a few minutes, I convinced myself that it was nothing, and I lay back down, pulling the blankets tighter around me. Sleep didn't come as easily this time. My mind was racing, running through all the possibilities, none of which made me feel any better. Then I heard it again. This time it was clearer, more distinct. A slow, deliberate creak of the floorboards, like someone was moving carefully, trying not to be heard. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears. I wasn't imagining it. Someone was in the house. I forced myself out of bed, my legs shaky as I crept to the bedroom door. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob, hesitating before opening it. I peeked out into the hallway, which was dimly lit by that same nightlight. Everything looked normal, but the uneasy feeling in my gut told me otherwise. I moved quietly down the stairs, trying to make as little noise as possible. My mind was racing. Had I locked the doors? Was someone really inside, or was I just being paranoid? When I reached the front door, I checked the lock. It was secure. I did the same with the back door and all the windows on the first floor. Everything was locked tight, just as I had left it before going to bed. But the feeling of being watched, something not being right, wouldn't go away. I stood in the middle of the living room, trying to calm myself down. Every little sound, the ticking of the clock, the hum of the refrigerator, felt amplified, like they were mocking my fear. I slowly made my way back upstairs, my ears straining for any more noises. As I reached the top step, I heard it again. Footsteps, this time much closer, coming from the hallway I had just walked through. My blood ran cold. I spun around, but the hallway was empty. My heart was racing, my mind scrambling for answers. Was someone toying with me? Or was I losing my mind? The silence that followed was suffocating. I stood there, every muscle in my body tense, waiting for something, anything to happen. But nothing did. After what felt like an eternity, I forced myself to move, inching back toward my bedroom. Closed the door behind me, locking it this time. My breathing was shallow, my hands slick with sweat. I sat on the edge of my bed, trying to steady my thoughts. But the more I tried to convince myself that everything was fine, the less I believed it. The fear was settling in, deep and unshakable. Something was off, terribly off, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in that house. I sat in my room for what felt like hours, the weight of the silence pressing down on me. Every creak of the house, every whisper of the wind outside seemed to carry a threat. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of the noises, trying to convince myself it was all just my imagination. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Very wrong. I couldn't stay in my room any longer. I had to know what was happening. Had to prove to myself that I wasn't just being paranoid. I unlocked the door and stepped back into the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. The nightlight cast long shadows that danced eerily across the walls, making everything seem off-kilter. As I moved cautiously down the stairs, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The window in the living room, which I was sure I had locked, was slightly ajar. The curtains fluttered gently, disturbed by the cool night breeze seeping in. My stomach twisted into knots as I approached it, dread pooling in the pit of my stomach. When I reached the window, I saw it, a faint, dirty shoe print on the carpet, just below the sill. It wasn't mine. Panic surged through me. Someone had been in the house. No, someone was in the house. I felt exposed, like a mouse caught in a trap, knowing the cat was lurking just out of sight. I glanced around the room, suddenly aware of every shadow, every corner that seemed too dark. I could feel eyes on me, watching, waiting. Then I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, a shadow moved. It was quick, just a flicker in my peripheral vision, but it was enough. I spun around, heart racing, but there was nothing there. The room was empty, yet the air felt thick with a presence I couldn't see. My skin prickled with fear, every instinct screaming at me to run, hide. I backed up slowly, my mind scrambling to make sense of what was happening. Then I heard it. Soft, shallow breathing, coming from the hallway. My breath caught in my throat. The noise was so faint, so deliberate, like someone trying to keep quiet. I wasn't alone. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Whoever had been stalking me, watching me for God knows how long, was in the house with me. My vision blurred with panic. I turned and bolted up the stairs, my feet barely touching the ground. As I reached my bedroom, I slammed the door shut, locking it with shaking hands. I pressed my back against the door, trying to steady my breathing. The fear was overwhelming, suffocating. My hands fumbled for my phone, nearly dropping it as I dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's calm voice answered. There's someone in my house, I whispered, barely able to keep my voice steady. I think they've been here all night. Please, send someone quickly. As I gave the dispatcher my address, I heard it, the sound that nearly made my heart stop. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, right outside my door. I clamped my hand over my mouth, trying to stifle the panicked breaths that were escaping. The footsteps paused, then continued, pacing back and forth in front of my door, as if the intruder was deciding what to do next. The dispatcher was still on the line, her voice a distant echo in my ear as she assured me that help was on the way. But all I could focus on were those footsteps, the terrifying realization that I was trapped, and the only thing separating me from the intruder was a flimsy wooden door. I prayed that the police would arrive in time, but deep down, I knew that whatever happened next, my life would never be the same. I pressed myself against the door, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps, the footsteps outside growing more deliberate, more sinister. The operator's voice on the phone was a lifeline, but it felt so far away, almost drowned out by the pounding of my heart. I kept praying that the police would get here in time, that they'd burst through the door and save me before the stalker could act on whatever twisted plan they had in mind. Then, as if answering my desperate plea, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. It was like a shot of adrenaline to my system, hope cutting through the paralyzing fear. The footsteps outside my door stopped abruptly, as if the intruder had heard them too. For a moment, there was silence. A silence so complete that I could hear my own pulse thundering in my ears. And then, in a flurry of motion, the footsteps retreated, moving quickly down the hall and away from my room. I could hear the intruder scrambling, the sound of a window being forced open somewhere in the house. I dared to move, stepping closer to the door, listening as the sirens grew louder, closer. I didn't dare open the door. Instead, I stayed where I was, frozen in place, until the unmistakable sound of the front door being kicked in echoed through the house. The police had arrived. Relief washed over me, and my legs nearly gave out as I unlocked the door and stepped into the hallway. The officers moved through the house with their guns drawn, their voices calm but commanding as they cleared each room. I followed behind them, my heart still pounding, but with a glimmer of hope that this nightmare was finally over. But as we reached the back of the house, where the window in the laundry room was wide open, my heart sank. The stalker was gone, escaped into the night, leaving nothing but the cold night air and an overwhelming sense of dread in his wake. Police didn't waste any time securing the house, but the damage had already been done. As they searched the rooms, they began to find things that made my skin crawl and my stomach turn. There were photos, dozens of them, all of me, taken from outside the house. Some were recent, from just that evening, but others were older, taken over the past few weeks, each one more invasive than the last. They also found a notebook, filled with detailed notes about my daily routine, my family's schedule, and even things about the house, like where the spare key was hidden and which windows were easiest to pry open. The most chilling discovery, though, was a bag tucked away in a closet near the back door. Inside were tools, rope, duct tape, a knife. It was clear that the stalker had planned for more than just watching. As I stood there, surrounded by police and the terrifying evidence of how deeply this person had infiltrated my life, the fear that had gripped me for the past few hours turned into something much worse. It became a fear that burrowed deep into my bones, the kind that doesn't go away even when the immediate danger is gone. When my parents returned the next day, they were horrified. My mom couldn't stop crying, and my dad was pale with a fear I'd never seen before. We knew, without even discussing it, that staying in that house was no longer an option. Within a week, we packed up everything and left Ohio behind, moving to a new city several states away, hoping to start fresh, to escape the shadow of what had happened. But even after we moved, even after we settled into a new house in a new neighborhood, fear didn't leave me. Every creak of the floorboards, every unexpected sound in the night made my heart race, made me wonder if he had found us, if he was watching from the shadows again. I couldn't shake the feeling that, no matter where we went, he was still out there, waiting for another opportunity. Police never caught him. He disappeared that night, as if he had never existed, leaving behind only the evidence of his obsession and the scars it left on my mind. I'm trying to move on, to live a normal life, but the fear is always there, lurking just beneath the surface. I check the locks on the windows and doors obsessively. I can't sleep without the lights on, and every time I see a shadow move out of the corner of my eye, I wonder if it's him. He's come back to finish what he started. Some nights, when the wind is just right, I think I can hear footsteps, faint and deliberate, just outside my window. And that's when I know I'll never truly be free of him. Not really. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed these chilling stories as much as I enjoyed sharing them with you. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel and give us a thumbs up to keep the terror coming. Your support means the world to us and helps us bring even more spine-tingling content your way. Before you go, don't forget to check out the video playing on the screen. It's packed with more unsettling tales and eerie experiences that you won't want to miss. If you have any frightening stories of your own or suggestions for future content, drop them in the comments below. Stay tuned for more haunting adventures. Until next time, sleep tight. You can.